understand?
My name is Michael T Sas-Rolfes. I'm a wildlife resource economist and I work independently. I've been working on the rhino issue for more than 2 decades. My early work in the 1990s looked at the incentives of private rhino owners in South Africa, and what I discovered was very interesting. That was initially when the South African government handed over rhinos to the private sector, they did so at subsidized prices and with relatively little legal protection of private owners' rights. But at the same time, the government had opened up the trophy hunting market in the late 1960s already, and there was a well-established market for trophies. And my research showed that what was happening in the early 1980s is the private owners were acquiring rhinos and having them shot almost immediately. And the reason for this was that the price that they were paying for the rhinos was well below the market value. It was just a list price that just covered the cost of transport. Once they released a rhino onto their property, the rhino, according to Roman Dutch law, was unowned property and ownership could only be claimed if the animal was killed, captured, or domesticated. Now, what was problematic was that it's easy to establish when an animal is killed or domesticated. Capture depended on some precedents in the case law, but for most private game ranches, their land areas were too large to be considered to be a captured enclosure. So according to Roman Dutch law, if you bought or were given a rhino and you released it onto your property, you could no longer claim ownership. So if a poacher came onto the property and shot that rhino, the rhino now belonged to the poacher. So the private landowners had an incentive, once they got their rhinos, to have them shot as soon as possible. And they didn't really have an incentive to breed rhinos. Then what I found is in the mid-1980s there was a dramatic shift once rhinos started going on auction and the price started to climb very quickly, and at the same time there were moves afoot to change the law to actually recognize private legal ownership of rhinos. This would be a game changer, because whereas previously if a poacher shot a rhino you couldn't claim damages against the poacher, now you could. You had stronger legal protection, and the combination of these two factors in the mid-1980s saw the price of a live rhino move from less than 5,000 Rand a rhino to, on the auction markets, up to 50,000 Rands in the space of just 4 years. And all of a sudden, incentives changed. The gap between the trophy price and the live price narrowed significantly. Instead of being 6 times as much, there was only something like a 60% markup. And so private owners all of a sudden had a strong incentive to start breeding rhinos. And the price of live rhinos has increased ever since, until it reached its peak in the year 2008, which is when South Africa's new poaching crisis started. And that has affected things adversely. But trophy hunting has been a very powerful driving force behind rhino conservation in South Africa since the late 1960s, and especially since that change in legislation and market pricing in the late 1980s.